Hello, everyone. Welcome to Jamaica 411, where lies die and truth prevails. Today, I'm going to bring to your attention something I find quite disturbing, and so should you. I'm going to be telling you something that Mark Golding has been saying for quite some time. We have challenged it in the past, but still he persists. He has persisted with these stories about his father and his father's contributions to Jamaican society. Just as he persisted in the lie that O.T. Fairclough founded the People's National Party, that he persisted in the lies that he won the local government election. He persisted in the lies that there are new taxation introduced by the government. He persisted in many, many other lies, or in any event, things that are not true. Many of you would have heard stories about Dr. John Golding's contribution to the polio effort. You would have heard the stories from persons who were alive at the time, polio victims. They will tell you he's a very nice man, very kind man, very generous man. You may have read it in the Gleaner, which was around at the time. You would have read it elsewhere in the Gleaner from persons who are writing about the events of that time, who were not there. You would have heard it, of course, from Mark Golding himself. You would have heard it from the Mona Rehab Center. And I can tell you that a large part of the story was embellished. Nothing, no gossa. When you hear the stories about John Golding and the polio effort, you would have thought that there was no Ministry of Health in Jamaica, only Dr. John Golding. You would have thought that John Golding was this nice white man who came down here to save poor black people from polio. What he was a bone fixer. For those persons who suffered deformities in the bones, he would occasionally perform bone surgery, fit them with straps and calipers, and they would also have needed to do physiotherapy to regain some mobility in the arms and the legs. So generally, his job was to make the polio survivors comfortable with the fact that they will be permanently paralyzed with no hope of recovery. For the adults, his job was to provide them with an opportunity to acquire a skill to help them to make a living. That was his job. As head of the rehab center, John Golding did not save the life of not even one person, black or white, because he was not a brain surgeon. He was not a lung surgeon. And they were the only doctors who could save the life of a polio victim in those days. John Golding was a bone fixer. But like any other medical doctor, he could examine, diagnose, and prescribe medication to his patients. So that sums up more or less the skills that Dr. John Golding had to offer in the fight against poliomyelitis in 1954 onward. But when you listen to the narratives of Mark Golding and others, you get an entirely different impression. An impression largely made up of fabrications, I suspect emanated from one source. You would have thought that he came to Jamaica, there was an outbreak of polio, Thousands died, and he was there to rescue them. He was there to care for the patients that came in. He was organizing the whole thing, and it was he that brought it under control. Wherever you hear that, from anywhere you hear that, it is an outright, adulterated lie. John Goling did not lead the polio effort in Jamaica. John Golding was not the front and center of the effort to control and eradicate polio in Jamaica. He was not. John Golding was not the face of the fight against polio in 1954. He was not. When the first case of poliomyelitis, the paralytic polio, was reported in Jamaica in June of 1954, thereafter, in July, there was another case, and then several others, I do believe in August. The government of Jamaica soon realized that it had a problem on its hands. But why was it such a big problem? Because this was the first time in the history of Jamaica we've ever had paralytic polio. First time, never had it before, never had it before. So the government would not have known how to deal with it. They didn't know how to deal with it, so they had to ask for outside help. And that's exactly what they did. So the Ministry of Health wrote to the health authorities in the United Kingdom and asked them to send someone, an expert, to help us with the polio, what was now identified as an epidemic. And they sent someone. Person that they sent was Dr. Melville McKenzie, who was described as a specialist in polio epidemiology. And we will discuss what that is later on. Now, at the time when the British sent Dr. McKenzie, Mark Golding's father was here in Jamaica. He had already arrived in Jamaica on November 22nd, 1953. So he was here at least 6 months prior to the report of the first case of the paralytic polio in Jamaica. So the authorities in Britain knew that Dr. John Golding was here. The governor of Jamaica knew that Dr. Golding was here. And I am sure that the Ministry of Health also knew that Dr. Golding was here. And yet, they had sought and received the expertise of Dr. McKenzie, a specialist in polio epidemiology. Now, what is epidemiology? Because it is important to know what that is in order to discover why the British felt it necessary that he is the man that we should be looking to help us with the outbreak of poliomyelitis in 1954. Epidemiology is described here as the branch of medicine which deals with the incidence, distribution, and possible control of diseases and other factors relating to health. To cut a long story short, the key terms in epidemiology are the words prevalence and incidence. Prevalence and incidence data are two of the most important tools used by epidemiologists to track the spread of disease. So that is a role of the epidemiologist. They are supposed to track the spread of the disease in order that it may be controlled and eradicated. Collect information, collate that information, put it into a report with his recommendations to the ministry so that the ministry will be able to take the steps necessary in the control and eradication of a disease. That's basically what the epidemiologist does. That's a role that they play in this public health crisis. And in 1954, we had a public health crisis, and that was the outbreak of paralytic poliomyelitis in the island for the first time. Many, I'm sure, must be wondering what the dickens is this polio. You've heard about it, but nobody ever says what it is. So polio is a disease which is caused by a virus, and that virus attacks the bones, spinal cord, muscles, lungs, and brains. It is usually taken through the mouth and nose. There was no cure or vaccine in 1954. So you had to depend on your immune system to fight off the spread of the disease in your body before it gets to your lungs and brain, because if it did, you die. Only 1% of those persons who contracted polio became paralyzed, and around 10% of those who became paralyzed died. And they died because the virus spread to the lung or the brain. So that is the disease, poliomyelitis. So England sent to us an epidemiologist, a specialist in polio epidemiology. The aim is not only to control, but to eradicate forever, if possible, the poliomyelitis. So the first thing we need to know is how many people are currently infected with the disease, where they are, where in the country they are. We need to know who they were in contact with. And those persons whom they were in contact with would have to be isolated for a period. Similar thing happened when we were dealing with the COVID crisis. We had to find the persons who were in contact with the persons that came down with the disease, and we have to isolate them to make sure that they did not contract the disease. That was how it was then, and the epidemiologist played an important role. Hence, that's why England thought it necessary just to send him. England would also have been influenced, I'm sure, by the fact that there were persons already in the Caribbean who would be able to assist the government of Jamaica with the control and the care of the patients. We need to keep the people alive. That would have been the most important thing, because polio is deadly. We need to get the people, we need to determine who has it, and that's the local doctors all over the island. They would have been the one to diagnose the patients and alert the authorities. And the patients would have been immediately transported to the Kingston Public Hospital. That's where the government had set up the care for all patients. It was centralized. But over time, they had decentralized it. And the other persons who needed to be quarantined to see whether or not they developed the symptoms, they would have been sent also to Kingston, to the Palisados. There's a place called Plum Point. That's where the isolation area was for those persons who needed to be quarantined. So that is the role of the epidemiologists. It is an indispensable role in the fight against any outbreak of a disease. And the British felt it necessary to send us Dr. McKenzie to play that role, because that was his specialty. So for those persons in those days who were unfortunate enough to contract the poliomyelitis and developed symptoms of paralysis, how were they treated at the hospitals in those days, in the 1950s? Well, of course, there was no cure. No cure, and therefore the only thing they could do, the doctors at the hospitals, was to try and make you as comfortable as possible until your body immune system fights off the disease. That's all they could have done for you. There was no vaccine at the time that could help you. Trying to speed up your recovery as well as preventing complications is another focus at any minute, because the disease is ravishing your spinal cord, your brain, and attacking your brain and your muscles and your bones. They had to be constantly on the lookout for any complication, especially in your respiration. if that were to occur, they had to put you on a respiration machine. At the time, it was called the iron lung. A very cumbersome equipment it was at that time, but it was useful in helping patients to breathe. Then, in the event of an attack on your brain, surgery may be required. And a neurosurgeon, that would be the job of the neurosurgeon or any surgeon who had experience in performing brain surgery at that time. These are the types of deformities that can occur in the bone as a result of the poliomyelitis virus. And what is required to treat these bone deformities are calipers. The calipers are shown on the left, or straps, which are shown on the right. Now, the job of the treatment of these bone deformities is the job now of the orthopedic surgeon. That is how orthopedics come into it now. And this was the job of Dr. John Golding. So we may say that the job of the orthopedic surgeon is at the back end of the treatment of the polio patient. The polio patient, when admitted to the hospital, is treated by the doctors there to keep them comfortable and to keep them alive. Once the disease has passed and the state of the patient is that they have fully recovered, no paralysis, no problem, no issues, they go home. There is no need for the orthopedic surgeon. He would have had nothing to do if all the patients had recovered and gone home. But for those who did not fully recover and who had various stages of paralysis, the muscle deformities in the bone, they were then placed in rehabilitation. And that now is how the Dr. John Goldings of the world came into it. So you must be now wondering to yourself, why is she troubling me with all this explanation about polio? I just want to get into this thing about Mark Golding's father. Well, in order for you to understand what I'm about to say, it was necessary for me to explain to you the treatment of polio at the time in the 1950s, when there were no vaccine, of course. And so now the real story begins. But where exactly should I begin? There is the history of John Golding himself when he was a student and thereafter. And there is the history of John Golding when he seemingly reappeared from out of nowhere, having disappeared for 2 years, and ended on a boat, a ship on its way to Jamaica. Now, where should I begin? Let me see. The only place to start this saga of the life of John Golding is at the beginning. And I can only describe Dr. John Golding as an international man of mysteries, a man who necessitated the creation of some very tall tales about his activities. And it all started when he was recruited by the Royal Army Medical Corps in 1946. John Golding was 23 years old when he graduated from Cambridge University and did his period of internship at the Middlesex Hospital in London in 1944 to qualify as a medical doctor. He was basically following into the footsteps of his father, Mark Golding. Sometimes you will see him referred to as Mark Golding, who was also a medical doctor, a pathologist in fact, serving the London area in England. But John Golding was no ordinary young man. He had graduated from Cambridge with honors, and at the time when he graduated in 1944, the Royal Army Medical Corps was on the lookout for a special candidate to join a research team that the British had in Tobruk, Libya. A research team that was located at the British military hospital there. So John Golding became their man of choice. He was recruited in 1946, trained, and was ready for his first mission to Tobruk, Libya. Now, this is where it now becomes very intriguing. What was that mission? What was it that the British military hospital was doing in Libya apart from attending to their injured soldiers? That I cannot say. But whatever it is, or it was at the time, it clearly involves some amount of secrecy. And so, when the orders came down that John Golding was to be sent on his mission to Tobruk, Libya, the decision was made that he should not travel as a military officer. Remember now, he was trained and he graduated as an officer of the Royal Army Medical Corps. His rank was that of a lieutenant. But the orders was very specific that he must travel to Tobruk as a civilian. So in his passport, it would have stated that he was a medical doctor as his occupation and his profession. You would have seen no sign that he was an officer. In his suitcase and traveling bag that he would be traveling with, there would not have been any military paraphernalia in there at all, because he was traveling as a civilian, and the British did not want anybody in Egypt, where he landed first, or in Libya to know that he was a military officer. No, isn't that interesting? So he arrived in Egypt, went through the process of immigration like anybody else, did whatever he was supposed to have done in Egypt, and then made his way to Libya. It was September 15, 1947, that he joined the specialists of researchers at the British Medical Hospital in Tobruk. There he remained until April 4, 1948, almost 6 months. But while he was there, he made several trips between Tobruk, the British military hospital in Fayid, Egypt, and the medical hospital of Haifa, which is located in what is now being called Israel. He was moving between those three British military hospitals for 6 months. And then his tour of duty was over. Whatever the British was doing in Tobruk at the time when they were in Tobruk, they were occupying Libya. It was just after the war, and they were occupying Libya. Whatever they were doing at these three medical facilities they had in North Africa, which required a civilian to be recruited in the Royal Army Medical Corps to receive special training. He was recruited on what they called an emergency commission. That was what they called it, an emergency commission. They recruited him, trained him, gave him military training, specialized training, and then they send him as a civilian. So all the time he was there, from September 15, 1947, until April 4 of 1948, he was going under and operating under the guise that he was a civilian, when in fact he was doing military work. So you can guess what that was all about. And you are sure to guess right. Yes, John Golding, at the beginning of his career, was a British agent. He was operating as a British agent for the Royal Army Medical Corps in Northern Africa. And he was clearly engaged to carry out some secret mission on behalf of the Royal Army Medical Corps, which apparently cannot be released until this day. What were they doing in Northern Africa at that time? And what was John Golding doing? What was his role in what they were doing? Did he ever cease to be an undercover agent for the British government? That we will discover shortly. Before the Royal Army Medical Corps could assimilate John Golding back into civilian life, they needed to create a story which would cover his time, that 2-year period between 1946 and 1948 would leave a gap in his resume. They had to account for that period for him so that if he applies for a job and they ask, what were you doing? He could tell them something. And so the story that they invented for him in order to protect their secret was that he worked with the Royal Army Medical Corps in the village of Tobruk between 1946 and 1948, where he was the only doctor for hundreds of miles. Now, we know that that is not true. The first thing is, notice the language they use at the beginning. He worked with the Royal Army Medical Corps as if he was a consultant. No, he was not a consultant. He was a commissioned officer, a lieutenant in the Royal Army Medical Corps. He was drafted, he was recruited, he was trained, he was a military officer. Stand up and salute his superior. Yes, sir, and take orders. That's what he was. And he did not work in the village of Tobruk, as they say here, where he's the only doctor for hundreds of miles. He was assigned to a team of researchers at the British Medical Hospital. That's where he worked. So this lie was created by the Royal Army Medical Corps in order to protect the secret mission that he was on and their secret. So eventually they sent him back to Britain. And there he was working at the Royal National Orthopedic Hospital. They said for 2 years at the hospital. He was the registrar. And they said he practiced and studied under Sir Gordon Taylor, whom they erroneously claim was considered the father of modern British orthopedic surgery. They apparently didn't do the research. Sir Gordon Taylor was not an orthopedic surgeon. He was an anatomist, a first-class anatomist. And an anatomist is the discipline which deals with the skeletal of the person, while the orthopedic surgeon would deal with the bones and muscles and bones, muscles, joints, and tendons, as we discussed before. Now you see how the thing tying in now, right? So they made up this story to give him a background to account for the 2 years when he had gone on a secret research mission in Northern Africa. Now, whoever it was that was responsible for creating a credible account of his movements back in 1946 to 48 was excessively and very careless. They did not do their proper research. And because of this carelessness, they could easily have blown John Golding's cover. The man who was considered the father of modern orthopedic surgery was a man called Robert Jones. And as you can see by his autobiography here, Robert Jones lived between 1857 and 1933. 1933, John Golding was 12 years old. And when he took up his appointment as registrar in 1949 at the Royal National Orthopedic Hospital, Robert Jones was already dead for 16 years. When John Golding took up his appointment as registrar in 1949 to understudy Sir Gordon Taylor, the anatomist, that was supposed to have been an appointment for 4 years. But for some reason, he cut his studies short and resigned in 1951. So he spent only 2 years of the 4-year course understudying Sir Gordon Taylor and then simply vanished. He disappeared. There is no record of what John Golding was doing when he resigned in 1951 until we hear from him again in 1953 when he was on that ship on his way to Jamaica. No record of what it was that he was doing at that time. He simply vanished and then reappeared in November of 1953 on the steamship Gothic on his way to Jamaica to take up an appointment as a senior lecturer in orthopedic surgery at the University College of the West Indies. And when I tell you about that, you are going to wonder even more whether John Golding had ceased at any time to be an agent of the British government. The University College of the West Indies was the first of its class in the British Caribbean. And after much deliberations and to and fro and all that needed to be done to set it up, on the 4th of October 1948, it held its first classes at its present location in Mona, in Kingston. And in order for them to offer degrees, they had to be affiliated with a more senior university, a university that is established and with credibility. So it was affiliated to the London University, which was first class in those days and perhaps still is today. So students would register with the University College of the West Indies and do their courses, at the end of which they would sit for their degrees through the London University. That's how it worked. Now, what is interesting about the University College of the West Indies is that it was never intended to stay as a college and stay affiliated to London University. The intention was for it to become a university on its own, which it was able to manage in 1962 when we got our independence here. And in order for the University College of the West Indies to achieve their first goal of becoming a university, they had to ensure that the staff that they recruited were quality and caliber staff. And so from this article we are looking at here, dated January 5, 1948, when the first academic staff members were appointed, you clearly see what the policy for recruitment of the academic staff were at the time. Now, after 5 months of advertising, they accepted applications and appointed 4 staff members. The first was a professor of botany, a professor of zoology, a professor of chemistry, and a senior lecturer in physics. 2 were from the United Kingdom, 1 from New Zealand, and 1 from Jamaica. So you can see that the policy of recruitment of persons were persons who had experience in lecturing. The UCWI initially started as a kind of a medical school because that was what they felt that was urgently needed, trained doctors in the Caribbean. So they started with the medical school and then they added other faculties as they went along. So the first recruitment that they made was of 3 professors and 1 senior lecturer. I want you to pay close attention to that because this is a clear indication of what the employment policy of the University College of the West Indies was in 1948 when it relates to the employment of academic staff. By January 15, 1953, the University College of the West Indies expanded its operation to having now its first teaching hospital. This is the first time we would have a teaching hospital in the region. And a teaching hospital requires staff, academic staff, in order to teach the students. But then the University College of the West Indies did something very extraordinary. They went against their own recruitment policies and hired a man who had no academic qualifications whatsoever, no experience in teaching, no experience in lecturing. That is John Goling. And they made him a senior lecturer and hired him to head the Department of Orthopedic Surgery. That's what they did. Now, the question for us to ask is, why did they do it? Were they asked to do so as a favor to the British government? Because John Goling was on a mission here in Jamaica. And when we began the teaching hospital here, it was an opportunity for them to bring him in as a senior lecturer, well placed to carry out whatever mission they sent him on. But let us continue with our investigations to see if we can discover what that mission was. John Goling came ashore in Jamaica on the 22nd of November, 1953, aboard the Queen's ship, the Gothic, the SS Gothic. And according to the manifest of the SS Gothic, John Goling contracted to land in Jamaica with the other passengers. And the country intended for future permanent residence is listed here for John Goling as Jamaica. Now, you may not know, but the Gothic, as I said, was the Queen's ship. The Queen was expected for her first visit after her coronation. Her first visit here was in Jamaica, in the Caribbean, was in Jamaica. And her ship was sent ahead of her. She and Prince Philip came in by air. So the Gothic was dispatched with its escort, with members of her royal, what they call them now, her royal household. And John Goling and a few other passengers, they were just civilian passengers aboard the Gothic, taking a ride to Jamaica, which was the final destination. So when you hear it being said that John Goling was on his way to Chicago to take up an appointment there and stop in Jamaica, found that he loved it and decided to stay, that is part of, again, somebody's made-up story in order to account for the reason why he's in Jamaica. They want to hide that fact, and to hide a fact, you have to create a narrative which people will accept and not suspect what it is that you're really up to. So that was him and the Gothic. So he arrived on the 22nd of November in 1953. No sooner than he arrived here, by June of 1954, something happened in Jamaica which was to change the lives of many people. Our first case of paralytic polio was reported on the 9th of June, 1954. And before long, the government found that it had a problem on its hands and asked for help from the British government, which arrived on August 25 in the person of Dr. McKenzie. Dr. McKenzie arrived and sprung into action. He went and he visited various places, various hospitals where patients who were suffering from polio were being housed. And at the end of about 2 weeks or 3 weeks, he was able to give the Minister of Health, Rose Leon, a report on his findings as to the origin and the spread of the polio virus in Jamaica. And I'm going to let you see that now because we're coming down to the crux of the matter. Now I'm going to read for you a part of the report of Dr. McKenzie that he had sent to the Ministry of Health. And he would have sent it to the Ministry of Health some days before it was actually published in the Gleaner in September 13, 1954. I'm going to read it for you because it's very, very important that you hear what Dr. Melville McKenzie said was the cause of the poliomyelitis epidemic in Jamaica in 1954. Very important. So let me read it for you. It says here, specialist reports. This is a headline. And anybody who has the archives, the Gleaner archives, can go and read it for themselves. It was published in the Gleaner September 13, 1954, and the headline started by saying on the front page, specialist reports, polio spread from Moneymusk area. Facts show endemic virus. And what that means, endemic means, is that it's a virus, a local virus that's been spreading for a little while. The report reads, before passing to a consideration of the present outbreak of acute poliomyelitis in the island of Jamaica, it may be useful to give a general background of the epidemiology of the disease, particularly in the island communities. Poliomyelitis is widely spread throughout the world. The first recorded epidemic occurring in St. Helena in 1834. The disease was shown as a clinical entity in Great Britain 130 years ago. Since 1940, however, serious outbreaks have occurred in the Eastern Mediterranean, Malta, South Africa, Mauritius, St. Helena, France, Italy, Britain, Germany, Austria, and the Nicobar Islands. In North America, the disease has increased progressively since the beginning of the century, as well as in Latin America, Argentina, Chile, Costa Rica, Cuba, and it says here, I believe it's 1948 and 1952, Mexico, Puerto Rico, and Uruguay. In Africa and the Far East, where the disease tends to spare indigenous inhabitants and attack newcomers, outbreaks have occurred in Rhodesia, Angola, South Africa, and Mozambique, as well as in Bombay, Singapore, Bangkok, Japan, Korea, and the Philippine Islands. So what the doctor is saying here, that this disease is going bad. It started in 1834 is the first time they noticed it. Then it broke out in England, and from then it has been getting progressively worse and more aggressive. Except for the indigenous people of Africa and the Far East, who seem to be immune to this disease. And it's very important that you pay attention now when I speak about the immunity of the Africans. That's what he's saying there. All right, so we're going now to page 7. On page 7, the heading is Specialist Reports on Polio Outbreak Here. Now it says here, in the case of Jamaica, the disease is recorded as appearing annually since 1933, both in Kingston itself and all the parishes, with only 3 exceptions. It will be noted, however, that during this time, no serious outbreak of the illness was observed, the maximum number of cases being 13 in 1950, 4 of which occurred in Kingston, as compared with 318 cases which have occurred so far in Jamaica this year, or 218 cases. This pattern closely resembles experience elsewhere, in England and Wales, for instance. From 1912 to 1946, the yearly totals fluctuated from 228 to 1,297, but in 1947, the number suddenly reached 7,766. It would appear that in the case of both Jamaica and England and Wales, the sudden rise must be due to one of three possibilities. That is, an increase in the virulence of the endemic virus, a lessening of resistance amongst the population, or the introduction of a new and more virulent virus. These three possibilities will be discussed later in this report. The first known cases in the present outbreak in Jamaica occurred in the Monimusk area of the parish of Clarendon. I want you to listen carefully now. This is where I want you to listen very carefully. Let me read it again. The first known cases in the present outbreak in Jamaica occurred in the Monimusk area of the parish of Clarendon. It is known that a patient that he's calling ML became ill on the 9th of June 1954 with paralytic poliomyelitis, which was confirmed in the University College Hospital. A second case, EG, occurred on the 12th of June 1954. A third case, AN, on the 20th of June 1954, and a fourth case, JH, on the 20th of June 1954. Did you hear that? You recall me repeating to you that the first case of polio was reported on the 9th of June 1954, and that the second case was in July of 1954, 1 month later. Do you recall me saying that? Do you recall? And if you do you know where I got that information from? Yes, it was from the same gleaner. The gleaner kept, whenever it is that they're going back to give us a reminder of how the disease started. That's what they keep saying. That the first case was reported on the 9th of June. And the second case was reported in July. That's what they said. And yet, here is the very good Dr. Melville McKenzie telling us that that is not true. There were, in fact, 4 cases coming from the Monimusk area. 4 cases were coming from the Monimusk area, and yet only 1 was reported to the government. The other 3 were not reported. Now I want you to pay very close attention to the language that Dr. McKenzie used here. In the first line, it says, the first known cases, not the first known case, the first known cases. What that tells you is that the 4 of them were known by the same people. Even though here he said that the first one, which occurred on the 9th of June 1954, he said that the case was confirmed at the University College of the West Indies. He actually is referring to the other 3 as well, because he said the first known cases. So they were known, and you notice he gave date and names. It meant that somebody had it written down somewhere that these 3 persons, 4 of them in fact, came to the facility. They were diagnosed with poliomyelitis. For some reason, only 1 was sent and reported to the government. But all 4 of them were known at the same place. That's what this is saying. So it is when he went to look into the fact that a case came out of Monimusk, and he went to check the records, because Moneymusk didn't have the record. There's no hospital in Moneymusk, so he had to go somewhere and check. And it's in the process of checking the records at the university hospital where the first case was reported that he found the other three cases. The one on the 9th, one on the 12th, and two on the 20th. And somehow they missed it. As I go along, you will see that Dr. McKenzie did not state that the four persons who were infected with the disease, when they came down with the paralysis, he never said that they went to a local doctor who would diagnose them. That's not what he said. He never reported that. Yet all four of them took up themselves, got up in the morning, bathed, prepared up themselves, took the expense and trouble to travel all the way into Kingston, not to the KPH that they all know with KPH's reputation. No, they took up themselves and for some odd reason went to the university hospital. They obviously met a doctor there. That doctor at the university hospital who saw the four patients, doctor or doctors, coming from Clarendon and diagnosed them as having poliomyelitis, reported only one to the government. The government did not know that there were four cases. They all were operating on the assumption that there was only one. Now, you can imagine that when Dr. McKenzie discovered this strange occurrence, that he would repair immediately to the university hospital to quiz the doctor, because the doctor may have some information for him. Wouldn't you expect that? And yet he never said in his report that he did that. Now, it's possible that he left it out of his report, or the government chose not to report it. Very possible that he may have reported it elsewhere, but just not to the government of Jamaica. But that is a very strange occurrence. Who could have been that doctor who received these patients all the way from Clarendon? And how did they come to know that they should go to the university hospital? Why not a local doctor? Is it possible that somebody told them that you need to come and meet me or come and see me if you get ill? Or somebody said to them, you know what, go on to the university hospital and let them check you out. Whatever happened, there were four cases that occurred, and they all occurred in the very same area. But if you think that that is strange, let me continue to read. You're going to hear something that's stranger than strange. So let me continue. So Dr. McKenzie went on to say, subsequently, cases began to be notified from different parts of the island. All the parishes except Hanover eventually reporting cases of the disease. After the illness had been occurring in Clarendon for about 6 weeks, cases began to occur in Kingston, the first indigenous case being CA, who became ill on the 15th of July 1954. That was the one that the Gleaner was reporting. And that was why the government and the press and the people of Jamaica thought there were only two cases. He then went on to say, on the 28th of June 1954, a child, CE, arrived in camp, that's upper camp where the soldiers are, arrived in camp from England, stayed in a house in Kingston, and developed poliomyelitis on the 7th of July 1954. Listen to this. Subsequently, a second child, MC, who was in camp, same place in camp, became ill with the poliomyelitis on the 23rd of July 1954. No certain connection between the two cases could be established. The normal precautions, including quarantine, were taken, and no further cases have occurred in camp. So what is Dr. McKenzie telling us? He's telling us of this strange occurrence where two children, one came in from England, all right, so you can say that child may have gotten the disease from England, came into camp and developed poliomyelitis. But there was a second child in camp as well. And all they look them cannot see how the two children were linked in any way, either by people or by water, anything that could cause the two children to be ill. Mystery number two. And after they were quarantined, there was no further illness in camp. Incubation. So they're talking about now the incubation period for the disease. Still interesting to hear. Let us discuss it. There was no occurrence that could be utilized to throw light on the incubation period. Man, I say, I don't know what the deuce is incubation period, and there is nothing for me as evidence to determine what that is. But he went on to say, nonetheless, apart from the first camp case from England, whose incubation period, on the assumption she was infected in England, was not less than 9 days, apart from one possible instance, no case is known in which a second patient appears to have been infected from another member of the family. There were, however, two brothers who developed poliomyelitis on the 24th of August 1954 and the 27th of August 1954, both who were almost certainly infected from a common source. You understand what it is Dr. McKenzie is saying? Dr. McKenzie is saying of the 200 plus people in Jamaica that had poliomyelitis, there is no connection between them, except for those two brothers who would have gotten it from the same home. If a child or an adult had the polio in the home, they were there, Jamaican people probably give them bush tea, think it's a little fever, give them a little bush tea, rub them down with this and rub them down with that, until they realize that something is wrong, when they start to realize that they're getting paralyzed. And yet, nobody else in that household developed poliomyelitis. So when somebody in the household had polio, them one had it. If there were 10 people in the home, it's them one had it. And this is very mysterious. So this is what he's saying. He went on to say now, this is very remarkable in view of the overcrowding in the homes of a majority of cases and the fact that quite a number of patients were nursed at home owing to the refusal of the parents to allow them to go to hospital. They don't want them to be isolated, so they try to treat them themselves. In general, only cases with paralysis were notified, but there is no doubt that a number of abortive cases and cases with suspicious minor illnesses were occurring, only a proportion of which were treated in hospital or came to the notice of the health authority. In addition, inquiries were, in some cases, very difficult and the results uncertain. Only in relatively very few instances was it possible to definitely connect cases. You hear that? So what he's saying here is that people used to just take care of them sick at home, and only when them realize that them start to become paralyzed in the limbs, that's when them decide to rush them to hospital because they realize no, something serious are going on. But even with all of that, when they start to do the contact tracing, they just could not find how the people got the disease and why it is only one member of the household came down with disease and nobody else in the house for a disease that they say is highly infectious. Mystery, mystery, mystery. Anyway, he went on to say, there is no evidence to suggest that food, milk, water, or sewage could be held responsible for the outbreak, which extended rapidly over the whole island from June to August. food and milk supplies, latrine accommodation, and sewage disposal vary completely in the different areas. The outbreak occurred at a time of the year which corresponds with outbreaks in countries in the temperate ones. In these zones, season undoubtedly exercises a profound effect on the epidemiological behavior of the disease. But in the tropics, cases may occur uniformly throughout the year. This applies to both endemic and epidemic forms. Finally, there is the possibility that a new virus has been introduced, possibly in the Clarendon area, as this parish was infected before any other areas. This, it would seem, could only be effected by either laborers returning from a heavily infected country as the United States, repatriates on financial grounds, and similar areas, or tourists. The latter source of infection can be reasonably disregarded. Tourists do not, in general, come in intimate contact with the indigenous population, particularly in the rural districts of the interior of the island. The question of returned laborers, however, is another question. Jamaican laborers from different parts of the United States, where the disease is widely epidemic, return regularly in considerable numbers, both to Kingston and to other parts of the island. If a new virus has been introduced, it might well be through this extensive movement between other countries and Jamaica. It is impossible to say whether or no the present outbreak is due to an enhanced virulence of an endemic strain or to the introduction of a new strain. In this connection, it should be remembered that poliomyelitis in very many countries is now a much more serious disease with a definitely higher incidence per 100,000 of the population than was the case before the last war. Whether this fact is due to increased virulence in an indigenous strain or to the introduction of a new virus is, in the present state of our knowledge, not known. So he is now speaking about control, how you control the disease. He made 8 suggestions to the government. I am going to read number 8 because number 8 is telling us something that contradicts what people like Mark Goling and other persons who are writing about that period of time. I want you to listen what he says here, right? The present outbreak of poliomyelitis will leave in its train a number of individual problems in relation to orthopedics and rehabilitation. In order to educate patients, particularly in the case of an adult, who may in some cases have to completely change their method of gaining a livelihood. This may involve setting up an orthopedic department with gymnasium and training facilities. Let me ask you a very serious question. What Dr. McKenzie is suggesting here is that the government needs to establish a rehabilitation center. Now, when he went to the University College of the West Indies on the 28th of August, he went there on a tour. He went to KPH, he went to Plum Point where they have the isolation center, and he went to the University College of the West Indies on the same day. And when he went there, if the university had at that time on the 28th of August set aside the theater for the purpose of establishing a rehabilitation center. Don't you think they would have taken him there and shown him this is the place that we plan to set up a poliomyelitis rehabilitation center? We set this place aside. What do you think? You think it can work? Wouldn't you expect that that is something that they would have said to him? He would have asked, you have anything for rehabilitation? He said, yes, man, it's not ready yet, but we have this building set aside and so on. And then you would have seen it in his report. Instead, what you're seeing here is him making the suggestion because he did not see any evidence that Jamaica was looking in that direction. So when they are telling you, Mark Golding and the Sir John, what I call it now, the Sir John Golding Rehabilitation Center, and all these other people telling you that John Golding had found this place and got permission from the University College of the West Indies to establish his polio center from July. It must have been a damn lie. Straight from the pit of hell. Because if that was the case, they would have shown him the facility when he went on tour. Now, I am going to further prove to you that John Golding had nothing to do with the establishment of the rehabilitation center, nothing at all. And that it was the government of Jamaica, acting on the advice of this report, who took the steps to go and find the building on the University College of the West Indies compound. And they were the ones that were repairing the building and retrofitting it in order to provide rehabilitation services to the persons now who were paralytic and needed the help. And I'm going to further show you that what it was that John Golding did. He met with Madame Rose Leon. She was Rose Leon at the time. He met with Rose Leon as a minister on the 17th of August. And he went there with a proposal that the government would finance and put in place a workshop, making him the head of it. And he would offer his services free of charge if they were to establish it. He can manufacture the straps and the calipers for the patients. And he has no problem. He will get the people who can do the work, but he would like to be in charge of it. That's what he went to the minister with. There was no mention of the ministry funding or establishing any poliomyelitis rehabilitation center. No evidence. And I'm going to show you that one as well, so you can read it. So the idea of the poliomyelitis rehabilitation center was suggested by Dr. McKenzie. This report the ministry would have gotten days before. They would have studied it, read it, brought it to cabinet, and then when they satisfy and they sign off on it, they would have discussed with Dr. McKenzie various aspects, got clarity, and then they decide to bring it to the attention of the public, and it was published on the 13th of September, the day before he actually left for Trinidad to go and help them with their polio problem there. Now, let me read on. He said, as a preliminary step, a careful study should now be made covering the provision of skilled medical and nursing help, accommodation, and material for rehabilitation in light of the number of patients with residual paralysis and the type of that paralysis. So he's saying, look, ministry, you need to go sit down and figure out now how many persons you actually have with paralysis, because you're going to need to rehabilitate them so that they can find a livelihood, especially the adults. And you have to work on these people. You can't just allow them. Now, of course, this was going on in other places like in the United Kingdom and in the United States. And that was what he said to the ministry. Now, the last part of what he said now, he referred to as sound steps. So he's now giving the Ministry of Health an evaluation of his views and what steps they have taken so far. And this is what he said. In conclusion, Madam Minister, I should like to thank you personally for the facilities which have been given me through you to study the epidemiology of the present outbreak. I trust my report will be of service to you in the control of the present and any future outbreaks of poliomyelitis. I consider that the steps which the health authorities have undertaken to combat the present epidemic in Jamaica are in accordance with the principles now generally accepted, having regard to the staff and hospital facilities available in the island. So he said, kudos, man. Good job. He then went on to say, I am deeply indebted. Now him start to give an acknowledgement now of all the persons. This is how academics learn at the university. You don't just go and do things, get help, and don't come out and give the people who helped you an acknowledgement. So he's acknowledging now all the persons who would have assisted him. Listen to this now, because this is also another clue. He said, I am deeply indebted to Dr. Lawrence Fitzmaurice, Director of the Medical Services, who has put himself entirely at my disposal and has accompanied me throughout my investigations. I should also like to express my gratitude to Lieutenant Colonel Colston Babbage of the Royal Army Medical Corps for the information he gave me regarding early cases in Moneymusk. It was Lieutenant Colonel Babbage who told him, so there was the first case that went, so Moneymusk did take place, and that is how he went there now and found out that Moneymusk was the epicenter, and found out all the other things he found out. That the patients had gone to a hospital and only one case was reported for some strange reason. So he's giving Colonel Babbage kudos. He's thanking him for that piece of information, right? He said, as well as Dr. Ferreira. Dr. Ferreira, by the way, was the man who was put in charge of the coordinating the efforts to control and eradicate polio. Not Mark Goling's father, not John Goling. His name was Ferreira, Dr. Ferreira. So he says, for the information he gave me regarding early cases in Moneymusk, as well as Dr. Ferreira, Dr. Watson, and Mr. Brown, who have placed at my disposal the results of their painstaking epidemiological investigations. So these men were doing their own checks until he came. He said, my thanks for clinical and pathological information are also due to Mr. Ovina, Dean of the University College Hospital, and his medical staff, particularly Professor Cruikshank, Dr. Hugh Jones, and Dr. Hill, as well as the medical staff of the Kingston Public Hospital, especially Dr. Chambers, Dr. Meir, Dr. Marsh, Dr. Whitelock, Dr. Wilson, and Dr. McNeil Smith, the latter for showing me the cases at Plum Point Isolation Hospital. Mention should also be made of the help in my inquiries given by Dr. Martin of Another Bay Hospital, Dr. Blade of the Sugar Plantation at Moneymusk, and Dr. Guilfoyle and Dr. Jones, both of Maypen. And that is the close of his report. Now, I am going to ask you now to tell me if you notice a particular name that was not mentioned in this acknowledgement. Yes, you were listening out for it, and I was reading for it, and it wasn't there. There was no mention of thanks to Dr. John Golding. And what that would suggest is that Dr. McKenzie never met Dr. Golding. He was in the island while Dr. McKenzie was here, but at some point, he supposedly had left and gone back to England. Well, guess what? There's such a thing as phone in those days. So, whatever information he got from the university college and the hospital never came from Dr. John Golding. And yet, he was an orthopedic surgeon who would have been dealing with cases, who would therefore and ought to therefore have made himself available to help Dr. McKenzie in his attempt to try and figure out where the devil this disease come from. He was not available to him. Gone about in business. Never saw Dr. McKenzie. And again, I ask the question, why? Why would he, on the 6th of September, he was giving lectures to nurses. And Dr. McKenzie was here from August 25. If he knew he wanted to leave the Jamaica, if he had an emergency, or if something happened, or he planned to leave Jamaica for England, shouldn't he have gone out of his way to ensure that he met with Dr. McKenzie to tell him all that he needs to know? What about the possibility of a phone call? And I'm going to show you something which the ministry said. And what the ministry said gave an indication that at some point they did not know where he was. Well, they knew that he said he went to England for some matter, right? But they didn't know when he was coming back. So what did they do? They asked the British government to send somebody else to come and help them, training the local doctors and nurses on how to use splints and all this type of thing. Why would they have done that? They did it because he was not in communication with anybody. And this at a time when the British government, his own government, sent a doctor here to help us. And he had information, and he never shared his information with the doctor. He just disappeared. And I wonder if there's a reason why he disappeared. I also wonder, in Dr. McKenzie's investigation of those 4 cases from Monimos that took up themselves and went to University Hospital, 1 was reported and 3 was not. I wonder who was the doctor who had seen those 4 patients. And I am sure that Dr. McKenzie knew. And his waffling and his rambling about whether or not the disease was caused by people coming from abroad with a new disease, or wondering if it was the disease just got more virulent, got more, aggressive, all that thing. And the one thing that he never said, when he spoke about the introduction of a new virus, he only spoke of one way a new virus could have been introduced: by people who traveling from elsewhere that had the polio, bring it into the island. And yet he never entertained the other possibility that the virus got here by the deliberate action of mankind. What do I mean by that? I mean that somebody took the virus not to kill off black people. That was not the intention. Not to kill off black people, no. But they would have known that the people in Jamaica are immune. So even at the time when the virus was going on bad and getting worse with other people, the same virus, the type 2 virus here in Jamaica, we were just getting sick with fever and overcoming it. No incidence of any question of paralysis in any muscle. Nothing like that was happening. Nothing. So it is not inconceivable that people wondered why it is that the Jamaican people were not being as affected as other people. You will recall that when Usain Bolt was running up and down the place and winning and creating records, everybody was wondering how this little island produced so many fast athletes. And so what did they do? The whole of them come down, them journalists and them coaches and all sorts of people came down to Jamaica to study our program, to look and see what the athletes were eating, to look and see what kind of training regime they were under, to look and see the environment in which they live in, to see if that had anything to do, so that they can now use that information, go back to their country and improve their own athletes. It is natural and normal. That's how them white people behave. And yet, Mr. McKenzie, Dr. McKenzie, was not inclined to look at the possibility that somebody brought the virus here, not intending to harm people. But what they wanted to do is to find out why it is that we had such immune to the type 2 virus. Because if they can discover our immunity to the virus, then they will be able now to create a vaccine that would help their people. In the process of attempting to find out what our immunity is, what is the nature of our immunity to the type 2 poliomyelitis, they may have injected one or two persons with a particular serum in order to find out how they would react to that serum. And the disease broke out, which is why the 4 patients in Moneymusk would have been told to come to whoever it was at the university hospital. And that would have been also the reason why they reported only 1 case and hid the other 3, because they would have been found out. Is it possible that this British agent who was sent here, John Golding, and put in that nice position as senior lecturer in orthopedic surgery, is it possible that they sent him here to test the new vaccine that they were developing? Because one of the funny things about the English vaccination program, into polio, is that they never said where they went to test the vaccine. You can't just take out the Mahoney type 1 out of the serum and replace it with another polio virus, but not as potent, and then just go take a juke people with it. That's not how it works. You have to test it. And you can go online if you like. You would read until thy kingdom come, and you cannot find where the British went and tested their vaccine. You can't find where they went in the world and test the vaccine. They never said they tested it in England. They never said they tested it anywhere. You will go online and you will read that Jonas Salk, who developed the vaccine, the main and the first one to develop the vaccine for polio, you will go and read that his tests were carried out in the United States, Canada, and Finland. When it comes to Sabin, you would have learned from online reading that Sabin could not test the vaccine in the United States, right? Because Salk more or less was accepted. He tested his vaccine in Russia and in Czechoslovakia. You'd read that online. You will also read online about this fellow called Hilary Kapowski, who was the first European to attempt to use a live poliovirus to create a vaccine which would help the human immune system to ward off the poliomyelitis. You have learned that when he went and did his experiment in Ireland, it was a disaster. He went also in the Belgian Congo, but you don't hear what the result of that was. You would have heard that. What you will not find online is where the British went to test their new vaccine that they were developing. And we want to know why. Is it possible that John Goling came here to test the British vaccine because they would have realized that we have a particular immunity, and they were probably hoping that all would go well and they could now go back to England and say, we did the human testing on these people. This is the reaction they had to it. Let us try and fix the serum and see if we can improve. And then they would have come back to we again and test it out. And would you believe there was something very strange about our particular outbreaks of poliomyelitis? 1954 was the first time we had a paralytic poliomyelitis. And after that, it never occurred every year like everywhere else in the world, Strangely enough, it occurred every 3 years. The first outbreak was 54. The second outbreak was 57. The next outbreak was 60. And because the Ministry of Health was expecting it to occur again in 63, they went and then got a whole heap of vaccine and said, all right, I'm going to fix your business. It never came in 63, but it came in 64, and only about 60 people were infected. And thereafter, very few people until we had none at all, until about 82. All of these strange things must be explained. Now you must be wondering to yourself, so if Dr. John Goling was not the doctor who coordinated the polio effort to control and eventually eradicate polio, then who did? If he was not the face of the polio fight, nor front and foremost in any saving of lives, who was? Those are very good questions to ask. And the answers are there. They have always been there in the Gleaner archive. It's just a matter of somebody going to do the research to see what was happening at that time. Now, you will recall the list of doctors mentioned by Dr. Melville McKenzie when he was giving his acknowledgement of those doctors and other persons who assisted him in gathering the information that he needed. If you do, then those doctors and individuals would have been part of the effort in the control of the virus, and they were indispensable. They were the ones on the ground. They were meeting the patients, the polio victims. They would have been treating them, diagnosing them, referring them to the hospitals, and informing the government immediately about the new cases. Then you have the numerous general practitioners in the field, as well as those who led the fight to bring polio under control within a few months of the start of the epidemic. And those are the individuals you will see here in this Gleaner article dated August 4, 1954. And the Gleaner headline at the time was Polio Epidemic Confirmed. And in the photograph you're seeing in the center, that is Rose Leon, the Minister of Health, as well as her advisors from the Island Medical Services. The Island Medical Services was the entity that was responsible for the health care in Jamaica prior to the coming into effect of the new constitution in 1944, which gave us some sort of a self-government. So even though we had a Ministry of Health, the Island Medical Services still remained, and the doctors as well as the ministry would work together on any disease or problems that we had. Now, in the Gleaner article, I'm going to read for you what it says here. It says, ways and means of preventing the further spread of poliomyelitis, infant paralysis, that's what it was called before, being discussed at a conference at the Ministry of Health and Housing yesterday, presided over by the Minister, the Honorable Rose Leon Center. Others taking part are from left, Dr. W.J.R. Wilson, representing the Jamaica branch of the British Medical Association, Dr. H.D. Collins, Second Medical Officer of Health, Corporate Area, Dr. S.E. Ferreira, Assistant Director of Medical Services Health, Mr. Fred Dragozan, Order of the British Empire, and he was a permanent secretary, Dr. Lawrence Fitzmaurice, Order of the British Empire. He was the Director of Medical Services. And then you have the Lieutenant Colonel J. Babbage, MBE, in charge of the military hospital at Upper Camp, and Dr. M. Watson, Medical Officer Health in the corporate area. So these were the persons who met with the minister to discuss ways and means of preventing the further spread of poliomyelitis. And you will notice that one very personable person, the subject of this video, who was not at this meeting. And that, of course, was John Golding, Dr. John Golding. Now, John Golding, I know, was in the country at the time because on August 17, he met with the minister alone, and I will come to that shortly. So these were the men who were working with the minister in order to prevent the spread of the poliomyelitis. They were the ones who were front and center of the fight against polio. They were the ones who decided what needed to be done, where resources should go, and what resources are needed in order to control and eventually prevent the spread as well as to eradicate poliomyelitis. It was this team that determined how many of the respiratory system, the iron lungs, that was needed. It was they who arranged for the loan. I guess the ministry would arrange for the loans of the iron lungs. They would have been the one to determine that they needed help from abroad, and they would have been the one to help Dr. McKenzie in his efforts to gather the information that was needed to aid them in their efforts. On the 1st of September 1954, a Gleaner article came out making this announcement: Ferreira to direct anti-polio drive. So he was put in charge of the anti-polio drive by the Ministry of Health. And let me read what it says so the headline doesn't trick us. Just want to be sure. It says, Dr. Sidney Ferreira, Assistant Director of Medical Services Health, has been appointed to direct, supervision, control, and care in connection with the poliomyelitis outbreak. A policy directive putting Dr. Ferreira in charge of the anti-polio campaign was issued yesterday by the Honorable Rose Leon, Minister of Health. Dr. Ferreira will be responsible for coordinating all medical activities in connection with the outbreak. He will be in control of isolation of cases in the outpatients department and in hospital wards, and the examination and treatment of patients affected with polio. The Minister of Health said yesterday that it will that it was necessary in the interest of the health of the people of the country that there should be centralized direction and control, as well as responsibility for dealing with the outbreak. Yesterday, Dr. Melville McKenzie, specialist in polio epidemiology, was accompanied by the Director of Medical Services, Dr. Lawrence Fitzmaurice, calls on the Minister of Education and Social Welfare, the Honorable Edwin Allen, and the Minister of Labor, the Honorable Jehobs McPherson. So this is the day when finally the ministry decided to put someone in charge of the coordinating the entire effort, including the examination and the in charge of the wards. Everywhere you have polio patients, he's in charge. He's in charge of the isolation area, he's in charge of the hospitals, he's in charge of the medical care, and he's in charge of the patients in general, even the outpatients department. Now, you saw the name, right? Sidney Ferreira. You're not seeing anything that says Dr. John Golding, right? You and I are seeing Sidney Ferreira. So if there's anybody anywhere in this world that is claiming that Dr. John Golding was the man who was in charge of the polio effort and he was the one that brought it under control, you now know, as I told you, as Karen Cross told you, that that is a fabrication, a lie from the pit of hell, made up by somebody who wishes to embellish the contribution of Dr. John Golding, trying to steal from the accomplishment of other persons. Because by telling that damn lie, that Dr. John Golding was the one who led the polio effort, what you're doing is stealing from Dr. Ferreira and all these other eminent doctors of their own accolades that they deserve for having saved lives and bring the polio under control. That's very dishonest and evil. And somehow they really, really thought that they would not have been found out. Just as a matter of interest, this story about the appointment of Ferreira, Dr. Ferreira, to direct the anti-polio campaign, it continued on page 7. And I'm going to read the final paragraph of the article. It says, "This morning, the Minister of Health will confer at the ministry with representatives from the Jamaica General Trained Nurses Association, the Director of Medical Services and his assistants, the matrons of the University College of the West Indies, and Kingston Public Hospitals on the need for nurses to take care of polio cases. Measures as to how best to meet the situation will be discussed." Now, these are some of the things that I find excessively puzzling as I look back in the archives. Because when the ministry says measures as to how best to meet the situation will be discussed, it seems to me quite strange, because here on the 17th of August, 1954, is a headline that was published in the Gleaner. Government to set up surgical equipment workshop to aid crippled polio cases. Now, this was the meeting I told you about between the minister and Dr. John Golding. And here the article says, government has decided to set up a workshop for the manufacture of surgical equipment to aid persons who have been crippled or deformed by poliomyelitis. Now, you heard who it was that is supposed to set it up, right? It says government has decided to set it up. It went on to say the equipment will be also used in cases where people are deformed or crippled from any other cause. This decision was taken by the government yesterday, which would have been the 16th of August, 1954, following preliminary discussions between the Minister of Health, the Honorable Rose Leon, and Dr. J.S. Golding, FRCS, Senior Lecturer in Orthopedics at the University College of the West Indies, who is a specialist in the manufacture and use of this type of equipment. So he is representing to the minister that he is a specialist in the manufacture of the type of equipment they were discussing the day before. The article went on to say the workshop will be established at the start in one of the old refugee huts on the University College of the West Indies grounds by permission of the University College of the West Indies authorities. Dr. Golding, who will be in charge, has offered his services free of cost. He will teach a local technician the art of manufacturing and using the equipment. A blacksmith will also be trained in the manufacturing process. This was the 17th of August, 1954. It was reported the meeting took place a day before. Now check this out. Also in that Gleaner newspaper of the 17th of August, 1954, was another article. And that article read polio lectures to nurses. Now, let me read it for you. It says, a series of lectures on polio designed to inform trained nurses on the proper care of patients suffering from poliomyelitis has been arranged and will commence on Thursday this week, which will be the 19th, at 7:30 p.m. The lectures will be held at the Kingston Public Hospital Nurses Home Lounge. The organizers are urging all nurses who can possibly do so to attend the lectures in the interest of themselves and the public. Now, you notice that it says the organizers. So it does not appear that it was the ministry and her technical team was made this arrangement for the lecture in the treating of polio patients. Now you recall that on the 1st of September, that article said that the ministry was going to engage in the same thing, giving a lecture to the nurses on how to treat polio patients, and they haven't decided quite yet how they're going to go about it. Well, here is somebody made that arrangement. So let's see if that meeting took place. So now we know it was Dr. John Golding who made the arrangement to lecture the nurses, and they seem to have done so without the involvement of the ministry. Now remember, at the time, Dr. Ferreira was not yet appointed to the position where he oversees and manages the poliomyelitis cases. They call it the polio campaign, anti-polio campaign. So he would have been free if he felt, as well as the other organizers, that the nurses could aid the process, taking pressure off the doctors if they knew how to handle the polio patients. So here we have Dr. Golding giving a lecture to the nurses, and this says it's the second one. Now, this particular lecture took place on the 6th of September. This was almost a week after the appointment of Dr. Ferreira to head the anti-polio campaign. So here he is at the KPH lecturing the nurses. You also recall that on August 17, the ministry said, well, we really need the nurses to get on board in terms of patient care, but we haven't yet decided how to go about it. So let us assume that the authorities heard about the lecture and encouraged him to continue. And I'm bringing this up for a reason. So let me read this very quickly. It says here, Dr. J.S. Golding, orthopedic surgeon at the University College Hospital, gave his second lecture on Monday night to the Jamaica General Trained Nurses Association at the nurses' home on rehabilitation of the patient in respect to poliomyelitis cases. In his first lecture the previous week, Dr. Golding had told how the patient should be handled in the first 3 months after illness to prevent deformities and to make it easier for the patient's muscles to regain power. On Monday night, he spoke of treatment after the first 3 months. He showed how by certain trick movements, muscles could be developed to take over the work of other muscles which had been paralyzed, and thus enable the patient to walk and to move his limbs. He also told of operations to cure deformities, prevent deformities from developing, and to restore movement to paralyzed limbs, and of modern instruments such as calipers, which had been made to enable a patient to move about and to be of some use to himself. So we take it from this report that it is the manufacturer of calipers that he had gone to the Minister of Health to discuss his specialty in manufacturing. So here we are now, 8 days later, on September 14, and as you will recall, the special report of Dr. Melville McKenzie was published on the 13th of September. So this is a day after the government now is making some announcement that it is going to be repairing one of the huts at the University College of the West Indies to house the rehabilitation ward for poliomyelitis victims. Now notice it is the government that says it will be doing it. All right? So they would set aside some money. They would have found the architect, found the contractors, and they would have gotten permission from the UCWI. They would have been the one to point out the building that they think would be appropriate, and they all agreed on it. And then now, this is what the Gleaner reported. Ward at UCWI for polio rehab work. It says here, work of repairing and providing an old hospital hut at the University College is being carried out for use as a rehabilitation ward for poliomyelitis victims. It is expected that the work will be completed by the end of the month, by which time 2 aluminum units ordered by Dr. Sidney Ferreira, chief epidemiologist for the polio outbreak, will arrive. The aluminum units will be used to accommodate patients and thus ease the congestion at the Kingston Public Hospital caused by the admission of polio patients. It says here, another hut at the UCWI is to be used in connection with the manufacture of orthopedic equipment for the rehabilitation of those who have been paralyzed or otherwise affected by polio. You see that? So the Minister of Health announced that they'll be setting up a rehab as well as a workshop to manufacture the equipment, which was John Golding's suggestion, and he was going to be put in charge of that. So you see now that it is the government of Jamaica who set about establishing the rehab center at the University College of the West Indies grounds. Now listen to this part. The Gleaner article went on to say, the Ministry of Health has asked the United Kingdom government to send someone for a period of 6 weeks to train local personnel in the manufacture of splints and other equipment to be used for polio rehabilitation work. Dr. J.S. Golding, senior lecturer in orthopedics at the UCWI, is not available for this work, having gone to England on other matters. And then they spoke about Dr. Ferreira has set up regional committees in the various hospitals which have polio cases. These committees are comprised of doctors, nurses, subordinate staff, and will be responsible exclusively for handling the polio cases. So you see, Dr. Ferreira was the man in charge. Now this is a little odd because if Dr. Golding left the island and was expected back in 6 weeks, what was the need for the ministry to ask the United Kingdom government for someone to teach them in the manufacture of splint? It seems to me that they may not have been in touch with Dr. Golding. I wasn't sure whether he was coming back, so they wanted to take precaution. Besides, the polio center was to be open soon. But if that was the case, what's a big deal? They could buy splint and buy calipers and straps. It seems a little odd to me. Minister Rose Leon and Dr. Ferreira, of course, made several visits to the polio rehab center while it was under construction. And this was one of her visits on September 29, 1954, which says, polio center will be ready soon. I'll read it just a few paragraphs. The rehabilitation center for polio victims, now being prepared at the eastern section of the grounds of the University College, is expected to receive its first patients in 2 weeks' time. The information was given to the Honorable Rose Leon, Minister of Health and Housing, yesterday when she made a visit of inspection to the center during the afternoon. The building was formerly used as a theater in connection with the refugee camp established at Mona during the war. Provision is being made for 2 wards with necessary conveniences for doctors, nurses, and subordinate staffs. Dr. Sidney Ferreira, Chief Polio Epidemiologist, who accompanied the minister, explained how the various fixtures would be arranged. And then he went on to say the minister inspected the doctor's room, which has adequate space for examination of patients, the nurse's rest room, which will be furnished with couches, the kitchen, the sanitary conveniences. She saw the electrical operated bedpan, washer, which supplies hot and cold water. The building is being remodeled to allow plenty of light and air, while the patients will have much land room on the spacious lawn outside. Dr. Ferreira said he proposed to build an open-air pavilion on the lawn where walking patients could relax, a gymnasium and swimming pool where they could exercise and receive physiotherapeutic treatment. Workmen were busy when the minister arrived. Mr. V.R. Crawford of Leonard de Cordova Limited, who has been giving a helping hand in getting things straightened out, was introduced to her. Mrs. Leon said she was pleased with the progress being made. Now, where is Dr. John Golding in all of this? And did you notice when Dr. Ferreira said he proposed to build an open-air pavilion? You heard that? He proposed it. Dr. John Goling had nothing whatsoever to do with the polio rehabilitation center except to manage it when the patients were transferred there on October 27, 1954. Now, I don't know if we need to bring you any further evidence that Dr. John Goling, the orthopedic surgeon, and what we believe to be an undercover government agent of the United Kingdom, who was here on a special mission, and we believe that it was to test the English vaccine that they were trying to develop at the time. They wanted to develop their own vaccine. England at the time was a fading world power, and they were afraid that if they did not get into the pharmaceutical business, the United States would dominate, and that they felt was not a good thing. And so they were desperate to develop the vaccine for polio. Let me say one final thing before I get into Mark Goling and his fabrications. There are some who would say, yes, but Dr. Goling did a very good job at the rehab. How could he have been a British government agent? He had settled in Jamaica and he lived here for the rest of his life. Beyond doubt, he did a very good job. He did a very good job at the rehab center. The patients will testify to that. But by being head of the polio rehab center would have put Dr. Goling in the perfect place to carry out further research for the British government, if that was what he was here about. For those polio survivors who spent some time at the polio rehab back in the day, who may still be alive today, do you recall seeing some things or hearing things that you didn't understand at all? Were they constantly taking blood samples from you? Did they also take other samples from you, such as urine samples, saliva, fecal samples, nasal samples? And were they doing it daily? Occasionally, they may have taken tissue samples from you, as well as bone samples. Do you recall anything like that happening at the time? Did they ever explain to you why they needed these samples and what they were doing with them? Did you ever notice well-dressed Englishmen who didn't look like doctors coming and going from the rehab center, who they never introduced to you, never told you who they were or what they were about? But you noticed they kept going into Dr. Goling's office and leaving with bags. Did you notice anything like that? And also in terms of the taking of samples from you, did it ever stop at any time while you were there? The answers to those questions, of course, will help us to understand whether there were any extracurricular activities being taken by Dr. Goling at the polio rehab center over the years. I'm of the opinion, that there should be a commission of inquiry into the poliomyelitis outbreak, because many persons' lives were broken. People died. And if this disease was caused by the introduction of a vaccine, which clearly would have been unstable, not ready for human testing, and it was done in secret without the knowledge of our government here, then those polio victims may well be entitled to compensation from the British government. And if they have already died, they have an estate. The families will be entitled to compensation. Because it was rather strange that with the report given by Dr. Melville, that nobody seemed to have looked into the idea of this doctor who saw the 4 patients but only reported 1. Who was that doctor and why did they do so? Was the doctor dismissed, or doctors? So I believe we need to have an inquiry into the polio outbreak of the 1954. So at length and at last, to the moment you've all been waiting for, Mark Goling and his many fabricated claims about Daddy. We're going to look at the comments that he made to commemorate what he called the 70th anniversary of the establishment of the Sir John Goling Rehabilitation Center, which of course is not a good beginning for him. This he posted on his Twitter page on April 3, 2024. Now he stated here that the Sir John Goling Rehabilitation Center was established 70 years ago. Is that true? As far as I know, what was established 70 years ago was a polio rehabilitation center. It has suffered 2 name changes. It became Mona Rehabilitation Center, and then in 2010 it was renamed the Sir John Goling Rehabilitation Center. But it is not factual. It's not factually correct, if there is any such thing, to say that the Sir John Goling Rehabilitation was established 70 years ago. And to make the point, should we go back and do research looking up the rehabilitation center then, and we were to type in Sir John Goling Rehabilitation Center, would we have been able to find it? And so no, the Sir John Goling Rehabilitation Center was established in 2010. But let us not split hairs about this particular one. Let's move to the next paragraph. He said here, the outbreak of polio in Jamaica spread rapidly in June 1954, and my father became the government's expert on polio. Is that true? If this was a court of law and Mark Goling was charged for fabricating stories and creating public mischief, when Mark Goling claimed here that his father became the government's expert on polio, how do you find him? Guilty or not guilty of lying to the public? He went on to say, it has only just dawned on me that my father was only 32 years old when he founded the center. Now, the center he's referring to is the Poliomyelitis Rehabilitation Center. Now, did Dr. John Goling found the Polio Rehabilitation Center on a charge of lying to the public? How do you find Mark Goling? Guilty or not guilty? So he went on to say, it is incredible to think of him taking on such a challenging responsibility at that relatively young age. Now, the next paragraph, Mark Goling went on to allege he had 100 plus children hospitalized at Plum Point Lighthouse near the airport. He, along with his lifelong friend, my godfather Sammy Henriquez, combined efforts to make special aluminum splints from the wreckage of a crashed Pan Am aircraft and flew in a respirator from Chicago to help kids survive who were fighting for their breath. Now, members of the jury of public opinion, Mark Goling has alleged that his father had 100 plus children hospitalized at the Plum Point Lighthouse. And we already furnished you with evidence that Dr. John Goling was not a part of the poliomyelitis management team, and therefore he had no powers to remove anyone as alleged by the defendant. Members of the jury, on the charge of lying by deception, fraud, and creating public mischief, how do you find the defendant, Mark Jefferson Goling? Guilty or not guilty? The defendant further alleges, however, the available beds at Plum Point soon ran out and the place was overflowing with polio patients. They had to move the 100+ children, many of whom were babies, to a building built as a drama workshop on the UWI Mona campus, which was converted into a giant ward. The implication from what the defendant Mark Golding is saying here, members of the jury, is that his father and Sammy Henriquez made arrangements to move the children to this facility that they built, the polio rehabilitation center as it was then. Is this true? Members of the jury, may I remind you that led into evidence were newspaper articles, documented evidence from the Gleaner reporting of 1954 that it was the Minister of Health, Rose Leon, who appointed Dr. Sidney Ferreira to lead the anti-polio campaign. And it was Dr. Ferreira who was in charge of the removal of all polio survivors from the Kingston Public Hospital, Plum Point Isolation Center, and from all the other hospitals where polio survivors were housed. And he arranged for them to be transported to the polio rehabilitation center at Mona on October 27, 1954. The charge for Mark Jefferson Golding is lying by fabrication. How do you find the defendant? Guilty or not guilty? The defendant, Mark Jefferson Golding, further alleged in his post on Twitter that having stabilized the immediate health crisis, the next challenge was what to do with hundreds of polio victims, many of them children who had suffered permanent disability from the disease. Members of the jury, is that true? Did Dr. John Golding stabilize the immediate health crisis? The charge against the defendant, Mark Jefferson Golding, is lying by deception and creating public mischief. How do you find the defendant? Guilty or not guilty? Members of the jury, no further charges being preferred on the defendant, Mark Jefferson Golding. You may now retire to consider your verdict. Please place the result of your deliberations in the comment section. Members of the jury, you will recall that at the commencement of this trial, the defendant, Mark Jefferson Golding, pleaded not guilty to all the charges laid against him. It now appears, members of the jury, that in the face of overwhelming evidence of his guilt, that the defendant, Mark Jefferson Golding, now seeks to enter a new plea, a plea of guilty by reason of insanity. The prosecution has no objection. Thank you, members of the jury. I thank you for your time and your patience in listening to all the evidence, and I look forward to speaking with you on another very interesting topic soon. Thank you so much again. Remember to subscribe, remember to hit the like button, and most importantly, please share. So until next time, walk good.